The winter of 1873 came early to the Wyoming Territory, bringing with it a bitter wind that cut through the threadbare coats of those foolish enough to venture outside. The small town of Bitter Creek huddled against the base of the mountains like a wounded animal, its ramshackle buildings offering little protection from the elements. Dust and snow mingled in the streets, creating a gray slush that clung to boots and wagon wheels alike. Margaret O'Brien pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she hurried through the back alley behind the mercantile. At 26, she had already lived more hardship than most women twice her age. Her husband, dead these 2 years from consumption, had left her with nothing but debts, and the suspicious glares of townsfolk, who wondered why a young widow chose to remain alone rather than remarry. The morning had started poorly. Mr. Henderson, who owned the ranch where she worked as a laundress, had accused her of stealing soap. The accusation was absurd. What use would she have for lye soap beyond what she needed for washing? But Henderson had been drinking again, and when he drank, he became cruel. "You think you're too good for honest work," he had shouted, his face red with whiskey and rage. "Think you can take what ain't yours?" Margaret had tried to explain, but Henderson wouldn't listen. In front of the other ranch hands, he had pronounced her punishment. She would walk back to town barefoot through the snow, as a lesson in humility. "Please, Mr. Henderson," she had begged, looking at the frozen ground. "It's 3 miles to town. I'll lose my toes to frostbite." "Should have thought of that before you turned thief," he spat. "Now get them boots off, or I'll have the boys do it for you." The ranch hands had looked away, unwilling to intervene but uncomfortable with the cruelty. Jake Morrison, the youngest of them, had started to speak up, but a sharp look from the foreman silenced him. Margaret had no choice. With trembling fingers, she unlaced her boots, her late husband's boots, the only pair she owned, and stepped onto the frozen earth. The first 100 yards weren't terrible. Anger kept her warm, and the ground near the ranch was packed hard from horses and wagons. But as she moved further from the buildings, the snow deepened. Each step became agony. The cold bit into her feet like teeth, and she could feel the skin beginning to crack and bleed. By the time she reached the halfway point, she could barely feel her feet at all. The numbness was almost worse than the pain. It meant damage that might never heal. She stumbled, caught herself, stumbled again. The town seemed impossibly far away, a collection of dark shapes wavering in the distance like a mirage. She fell for the first time near Skeleton Ridge, where the old cattle trail wound between 2 massive boulders. Her knees hit the ground hard, and she cried out despite herself. When she tried to stand, her legs wouldn't cooperate. The cold had crept up past her ankles, making her clumsy and slow. "Get up," she whispered to herself. "Get up, Margaret O'Brien. You've survived worse than this." But had she? She thought of her husband's final days, coughing blood into handkerchiefs while she held his hand. She thought of the banker who had come the day after the funeral, explaining that the homestead was forfeit, that she had 30 days to vacate. She thought of the women in town who crossed the street when they saw her coming, whispering behind their hands about the young widow who must surely be up to no good. The second time she fell, she didn't get up immediately. The snow felt almost warm against her cheek, and she knew that was a bad sign. When freezing to death, she'd heard, "You felt warm at the end, peaceful, even." A shadow fell across her vision. At first, she thought it was death coming to claim her, a dark angel against the white sky. Then she heard the soft snort of a horse, felt the vibration of hooves through the frozen ground. She forced her eyes open. A man sat atop a painted pony, looking down at her with eyes as dark as winter storms. He wore leather and fur, with feathers braided into his long black hair. A Comanche warrior, this far north. She should have been terrified. The newspapers were full of stories about Indian attacks, about white women carried off to face unspeakable fates. But Margaret was too cold and too tired to feel proper fear. She met his gaze steadily, waiting for whatever would come next. The warrior dismounted in one fluid motion. He was tall, taller than her husband had been, with broad shoulders and hands marked by old scars. Without speaking, he pulled a blanket from his saddle-pack, a beautiful thing woven with patterns of red and black, and wrapped it around her shoulders. "No," she tried to say, but her lips were too numb to form the word properly. He knelt beside her, and she saw that his face was younger than she'd first thought. Perhaps 30 winters, marked by loss but not yet hardened into cruelty. With surprising gentleness, he examined her feet, his expression darkening at what he saw. Then, without asking permission, he lifted her into his arms. She should have fought, should have screamed, but she had no strength left. He placed her on his horse with practiced ease, then swung up behind her. His body was warm against her back, solid and strangely comforting. As they rode away from the trail, away from Bitter Creek and all its judgment, Margaret's last coherent thought was that she should be afraid. A white woman riding off with a Comanche warrior. It was the stuff of nightmares and dime novels. But as unconsciousness finally claimed her, all she felt was the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the strong arms that kept her from falling. Whatever fate awaited her, it could hardly be worse than freezing to death alone in the snow, 3 miles from a town that had never wanted her anyway. The warrior guided his horse north, toward the hidden valleys where the wind sang lonely songs through the pines. Behind them, Margaret's footprints were already filling with fresh snow, erasing all trace of her passage, as if she had never existed at all. Margaret woke to the sound of wind howling through wooden walls and the crackle of a fire. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The last thing she recalled was the snow, the cold, and then darkness. She tried to sit up, but pain shot through her feet, and she gasped. "Be still," a deep voice said from somewhere to her left. Her eyes flew open. She was lying on a bed of furs in what appeared to be a small cabin. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. A fire burned in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And there, sitting on a wooden stool beside the fire, was the Comanche warrior who had found her. In the firelight, she could see him more clearly. His face was angular, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, pale against his bronze skin. He was carving something, his hands moving with practiced precision, and didn't look up when she stirred. Where am I?" Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Safe," he replied, still not looking at her. His English was accented but clear. "Your feet were badly frozen. I treated them with bear grease and wrapped them. You will heal, but it will take time." Margaret looked down and saw that her feet were indeed wrapped in soft leather, and she could smell the pungent odor of the grease. Someone, him, had tended to her injuries with care. The thought made her uncomfortable. She pulled the buffalo robe up to her chin, suddenly aware that she was wearing only her chemise and petticoat. "My dress," drying by the fire. It was wet from snow. He gestured with his knife toward where her brown wool dress hung on a peg. "You needed warmth more than modesty." Heat flooded her cheeks. "You had no right." "Would you prefer I had left you to die?" He finally looked at her, and his eyes were like obsidian, dark and unreadable. "Your people's foolish pride would have killed you. Feet frozen like that, you would have lost them, maybe your life." She wanted to argue, but the truth of his words silenced her. She remembered the numbness, the terrible certainty that she was going to die alone in the snow. "Why did you help me?" He returned to his carving. "Why does anyone help anyone?" "But She hesitated, unsure how to phrase it. "You're Comanche. I'm white. Our people are enemies." "Are we?" He held up what he'd been carving, a small wooden horse, delicate and perfect. "Do you feel like my enemy? Margaret O'Brien?" She startled. "How do you know my name? You talked in your fever, called for someone named Thomas, your husband." "He's dead," she said flatly, then wondered why she'd told him that. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the wind and the fire. Margaret's mind raced. She should be terrified, should be planning escape. This man could do anything to her, and no one would ever know. But something about his calm presence, the careful way he'd tended her injuries, made her fear seem foolish. "What's your name?" she asked finally. "My people call me Broken Arrow. White men call me Samuel." "Samuel," she repeated. "That's a Christian name." His laugh was bitter. "Mission school. When I was young, they tried to make me white, cut my hair, beat me when I spoke Comanche. Said they were saving my soul." He set down the wooden horse and picked up another piece of wood. "I learned their language, their ways. Then I went home." "To your family?" "No family left. Soldiers came while I was at the mission. My mother, my sisters." He didn't finish, but she understood. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, filled with ghosts. Margaret knew about loss, about the hollow feeling it left behind. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. He shrugged. "It was many winters ago." She studied him in the firelight. This man who should be her enemy but had saved her life. "Why do you live alone? Why not with your people?" "My people are scattered, broken, some on reservations, some hiding in the mountains, some, like me, caught between worlds." He began carving again. "This cabin belonged to a trapper who died 2 winters past. I found his bones in the spring, buried him proper, kept the shelter." Margaret tried to imagine it, living alone in this wilderness. Neither white nor fully Indian anymore. At least in town, miserable as it was. She had human voices, human faces, even if they were cruel. "You must get lonely," she said without thinking. He looked at her again, and something flickered in those dark eyes. Yes, the simple honesty of it made her throat tight. She shifted, trying to ease the pain in her feet, and winced. "You need to eat," Samuel said, setting aside his carving. He moved to the fire where a pot hung over the flames. "Venison stew, nothing fancy, but it will help you heal." He ladled stew into a wooden bowl and brought it to her. When she struggled to sit up, he helped her, his hands gentle but impersonal. She was acutely aware of his nearness, the smell of leather and smoke that clung to him. The stew was better than anything she'd eaten in months. Working at the Henderson Ranch, she'd survived on scraps and cornmeal mush. This was rich with meat and flavored with herbs she didn't recognize. "Thank you," she said between bites. He nodded and returned to his stool. They ate in companionable silence, the storm outside making the cabin feel like a small warm island in a sea of cold. When she finished, he took the bowl and set it aside. "You should sleep more. Healing takes strength." "Wait," she said as he stood to leave. "I need to. That is—" She felt her cheeks burn again. "I need to use the necessary—" Understanding dawned on his face. Without a word, he helped her stand, supporting most of her weight. The pain in her feet was excruciating, but she bit her lip to keep from crying out. He helped her to a chamber pot in the corner, then turned his back to give her privacy. When she was finished, he helped her back to the bed. The simple journey had exhausted her, and she collapsed onto the furs gratefully. "Tomorrow, I will make you crutches," he said, "so you can move without pain." "I can't stay here," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wondered where else she could go. Back to Bitter Creek? To face Henderson's wrath and the town's judgment? "Where would you go?" Samuel asked, echoing her thoughts. "Your feet will not bear weight for days, maybe weeks, and the storm." He gestured toward the door, where wind rattled the leather hinges. "This is just the beginning. Winter storms in these mountains can last for days." She wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her. As she drifted toward sleep, she heard him speak again, so quietly she almost missed it. "You are safe here. Margaret O'Brien, I give you my word." And strangely, despite everything she'd been taught about Indians, despite the vulnerability of her position, she believed him. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her. While outside the storm raged on, sealing them together in their small shelter against the world. The storm lasted 3 days. By the time it finally blew itself out, the world outside the cabin had been transformed into a crystalline wilderness of white. Samuel pushed open the door on the fourth morning, and Margaret gasped at the sight. Snow reached halfway up the doorframe, and the trees were so heavily laden their branches touched the ground. "We'll need water," Samuel said, picking up 2 wooden buckets. "The creek is frozen, but I know where to break through." Margaret watched from her bed of furs as he prepared to leave. Over the past days, they had fallen into an awkward rhythm, he caring for her with distant kindness, she accepting his help with growing unease. The crutches he'd fashioned from pine branches leaned against the wall, and she could move about the cabin now, though her feet still pained her. "I could help," she offered. "Gather firewood, perhaps?" He paused at the door. "Your feet are healing. You said so yourself. I'm not an invalid, and I won't be treated as one." Something like approval flickered across his face. "The woodpile is behind the cabin. Do not venture beyond it." When he left, Margaret struggled into her dress, now dry and bearing the faint smell of smoke. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and carefully made her way outside on the crutches. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but the air was clean and sharp, filling her lungs with painful clarity. The woodpile was well stocked, protected by an overhang of logs. As she gathered smaller pieces into a canvas sling, she heard voices carrying on the wind. Her blood froze. Voices meant people, and people meant, "Saw smoke from the chimney. Someone's living in old Jacobson's place? Probably just a drifter. Still, we should check. Mrs. Henderson's awful worried about that O'Brien woman. Says she might have been carried off by Indians." Margaret recognized the second voice. Bill Patterson. One of the ranch hands. Her heart hammered as she pressed herself against the cabin wall. If they found her here with Samuel. "You believe that?" the first voice asked. "Don't know what to believe. Woman disappears in a snowstorm. No body found. Either she froze to death and the wolves got her, or..." Patterson trailed off. "Either way, Mr. Henderson wants to know, says he won't rest easy till he's certain." Margaret heard the crunch of snow as the men moved closer. They were following the creek, which would lead them directly to the cabin. She had minutes, maybe less, moving as quickly as her injured feet allowed. She hobbled back inside and barred the door. Her hands shook as she looked around the small space. Samuel's bow hung on the wall, along with a quiver of arrows. His presence was everywhere, in the Comanche blankets, the parfleche bags, the ceremonial pipe on the mantel. She grabbed what she could, shoving items under the bed, into corners, anywhere they might not be immediately visible. But it was hopeless. One look at this place and anyone would know who lived here. The voices were closer now. Margaret's mind raced. She could hide, but where? The cabin was one room. She could try to run, but her feet wouldn't carry her far. She could... The door handle rattled. "Hello? Anyone in there?" Margaret stood frozen in the center of the room. Samuel's carved wooden horse clutched absurdly in her hand. "We know someone's there. Saw fresh tracks. Open up." What happened next would forever be burned into her memory. The door burst open. She'd barred it poorly in her haste, and Bill Patterson stumbled inside, followed by Jim Crawford from the general store. Both men stopped short when they saw her. "Mrs. O'Brien?" Patterson's eyes went wide. "Lord Almighty, you're alive." Crawford was already looking around, taking in the details of the cabin. His face hardened. "You alone here, ma'am?" Margaret's voice failed her. "Because this looks like an Indian's place to me." Crawford continued. "These blankets, that bow, you been here of your own will?" Before she could answer, Samuel appeared in the doorway behind the men. Silent as smoke, water dripped from the buckets he carried. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Crawford went for his gun. "No!" Margaret threw herself forward, her injured feet screaming in protest. "He saved my life!" But Crawford already had his pistol out, pointed at Samuel, who stood perfectly still, the water bucket still in his hands. "Step away from him. Mrs. O'Brien, we'll handle this." "Handle what?" Margaret demanded. "This man found me dying in the snow. He brought me here, tended my wounds. Without him, I'd be dead." "That what he told you?" Patterson asked. his hand also on his weapon. "Ma'am, with all due respect, these Indians got ways of making a woman think." "Think what?" Margaret's voice rose. "That kindness is kindness, that saving a life matters more than the color of a man's skin. You don't know what you're saying." Crawford insisted. "Clearly, you've been through an ordeal. Once we get you back to town, away from his influence, I'm not going back." The words surprised her as much as them, but as soon as she said them, she knew they were true. Go back to what? To Henderson's abuse? To a town that whispered about her behind closed doors? To scrubbing other people's clothes until her hands bled, all for a few coins and a corner to sleep in? "Ma'am," Patterson said slowly, as if talking to a child, "you have to come back. It ain't proper. You staying here with him." "Proper?" Margaret laughed, and it was a harsh sound. "Was it proper when Mr. Henderson made me walk barefoot through the snow? Was it proper when the bank took my home? When the good women of Bitter Creek crossed the street rather than speak to me?" Samuel still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself. He was waiting. She realized, waiting to see what she would choose. "You're not thinking clearly." Crawford said, "This savage has confused you. His name is Samuel." Margaret stepped between the men and the Comanche warrior, her crutches awkward but her voice steady. "And he's shown me more humanity in 4 days than Bitter Creek has in 2 years. The two men exchanged glances. "We can't leave you here," Patterson said. "What will people say?" "I no longer care what people say." Crawford's face darkened. "Then we'll have to take you by force, for your own good." He stepped forward, reaching for her arm. Samuel moved then, setting down the water buckets with deliberate care. He didn't reach for a weapon, didn't threaten. He simply stood beside Margaret, his presence a silent question. "You touch her against her will," Samuel said quietly, his English careful and precise. "And you will answer to me." Crawford's hand tightened on his gun. "You threatening me? Indian?" "I am stating a fact." The tension in the small cabin was suffocating. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, could see Crawford's finger twitch on the trigger. One wrong move, one word, and blood would spill. "Please," she said, looking from Patterson to Crawford. "Just go. Tell them I died in the storm if you must. Tell them anything, but leave us be." Patterson looked uncertain. He was younger than Crawford, less hardened. "Mrs. O'Brien, are you certain? You're not... He hasn't... He saved my life," Margaret repeated. "And he's treated me with nothing but respect, which is more than I can say for many of the fine Christian men of Bitter Creek." Crawford spat on the floor. "You're making your choice then, choosing a redskin over your own kind. I'm choosing freedom over servitude." Margaret replied, "I'm choosing kindness over cruelty. If that makes me a traitor to my race, then so be it." Crawford holstered his gun with obvious reluctance. "This ain't over. When word gets back to town, they'll come looking, and they won't be as understanding as us. Then I'll face that when it comes." The two men backed toward the door, Patterson still looking troubled. Crawford's face twisted with disgust. At the threshold, Crawford turned back. "You'll regret this, Mrs. O'Brien, when he shows his true nature, when he does what Indians do. You'll wish you'd come with us." "What Indians do," Margaret said softly, "is survive, despite everything your kind does to destroy them. Now get out." They left, and Margaret barred the door properly this time. Her legs gave out then, and she would have fallen if Samuel hadn't caught her. He helped her to a chair, then knelt to examine her feet, which had begun bleeding through the bandages. "You should not have stood on them so long," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "They gave me no choice." He looked up at her then, and she saw something in his eyes she couldn't quite name. "There is always a choice. You made yours." "And what choice was that?" "You chose the harder path, the one that leads away from your people, perhaps forever." Margaret thought of the life waiting for her in Bitter Creek, the contempt, the servitude. the slow death of spirit that came from being forever judged and found wanting. Then she looked at this man who had saved her, who had treated her with quiet dignity, who had stood ready to defend her without thought for his own safety. "My people," she said slowly, "abandoned me long ago. Perhaps it's time I found new ones." Samuel said nothing, but his hands were gentle as he rewrapped her feet. Outside, she could hear Patterson and Crawford's horses moving away, carrying word back to town. Soon, everyone would know. The widow O'Brien had chosen to stay with an Indian. The scandal would be delicious, the condemnation swift, but here in the cabin, with the fire crackling and the snow-muffled silence wrapping around them like a blanket, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. 2 weeks passed before they came. Margaret had known they would. Crawford's threat hadn't been idle, but she'd hoped for more time, more healing, more... What? She watched Samuel check the arrows in his quiver for the 3rd time that morning and realized she'd been hoping for the impossible, that the world would simply forget about them. "They're coming," Samuel said, gazing out the small window. 8 riders, maybe 9. Margaret joined him, her feet now healed enough to bear weight, though they still ached in the cold. A line of horsemen picked their way through the snow-laden trail, dark shapes against the white landscape. "I recognize some of them," she said quietly. "That's Reverend Morrison at the front, and Judge Carter." Her heart sank. "They've brought the law and the church." Samuel turned from the window. "You could still go with them. Tell them I held you against your will. Is that what you think I should do?" "I think," he said carefully, "that you should consider what you're choosing. They will not simply leave us be, not after today." Margaret met his eyes. Over the past fortnight, they had developed an understanding, a rhythm of shared meals and quiet conversations. She'd learned that he read books, had a small collection salvaged from abandoned homesteads. He'd learned that she could sing, had shyly performed old Irish ballads her mother had taught her. They'd shared stories of loss, of loneliness, of the strange paths that had led them to this cabin. But they hadn't spoken of feelings, hadn't acknowledged the way their hands lingered when passing dishes, or how they sat closer to the fire each evening. Now, with danger approaching, Margaret felt the weight of unspoken words. "I've made my choice," she said firmly. The riders reached the cabin. Reverend Morrison, a thin man with sharp features and cold eyes, dismounted first. "Mrs. O'Brien," he called. "We've come to bring you home." Margaret opened the door but didn't step outside. "This is my home now. Reverend?" Morrison's eyes flicked past her to where Samuel stood in the shadows. "You're not thinking clearly, child. This heathen has corrupted your mind. Come with us now, and all will be forgiven." "Forgiven?" Margaret's voice sharpened. "What exactly do I need forgiveness for?" Judge Carter, a portly man who wheezed when he walked, struggled down from his horse. "Now, Mrs. O'Brien, let's be reasonable. You're a white woman, a Christian. Your place is with your own kind. Not," he gestured vaguely at the cabin, "living in sin with a savage." "Sin?" Margaret stepped onto the porch, anger overriding caution. "Where was your concern for sin when Henderson cheated my husband on cattle prices, when the bank took our land through legal trickery, when I was left to starve or sell myself?" "That's different," Morrison said stiffly. "Those were business matters. This is about your immortal soul." "My soul," Margaret said, "is my own concern." The other men had dismounted now, forming a loose semicircle. Margaret recognized most of them. Shopkeepers, ranchers, the town's influential men who had never given her a kind word or fair price, but who now claimed to care about her welfare. "Be reasonable, woman." Judge Carter said, "We're prepared to overlook your indiscretion, Mrs. Henderson has even agreed to take you back, despite your theft." "I stole nothing." "That's not what she says, but we're willing to forget all that. Just come with us now." Samuel stepped out onto the porch beside her. Several men reached for their weapons, but Morrison raised a hand. "No violence. Gentlemen, We're Christian men. He fixed Samuel with a cold stare. You, Indian, you will release this woman and leave this territory today. I hold no one, Samuel said calmly. She stays by her choice. Her choice? Morrison's laugh was harsh. A white woman doesn't choose to degrade herself with your kind. You've bewitched her somehow. Used your heathen magic. The only magic, Margaret said, was common decency, something you seem to have forgotten. Reverend? Morrison's face darkened. You dare lecture me on decency? You, who would lie with an animal? The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She heard Samuel's sharp intake of breath, saw his hands clench, but before either could respond, another voice cut through the tension. That's enough. Morrison. Everyone turned. At the edge of the clearing sat a lone rider, an older man with graying hair and weathered features. Margaret recognized him. Dr. Ellis, who had tended her husband in his final days. Doctor, Judge Carter said, surprised. We didn't expect you. Clearly, Ellis dismounted, moving with the careful precision of age. I heard about this expedition. Thought someone should be here who actually cares about Mrs. O'Brien's welfare. He approached the porch, ignoring the others. Margaret, are you well? Have you been harmed? I'm well. Doctor, better than I've been in years. Ellis studied her, then looked at Samuel. You're the one who found her? Yes? Her feet were frozen? Badly. I treated them with traditional remedies. Ellis nodded slowly. May I see? Margaret sat on the porch step and removed her boots. Ellis examined her feet with professional interest. Remarkable. The healing is clean. No sign of permanent damage. You knew what you were doing. My grandmother was a healer. Samuel said quietly. She taught me. Indeed. Ellis stood, addressing the other men. I see no evidence of mistreatment here. Quite the opposite. That's not the point, Morrison spluttered. The moral implications are none of our business. Ellis interrupted. Mrs. O'Brien is a grown woman, recently widowed, with no family. She's free to make her own choices. Not choices that shame our entire community, Judge Carter protested. Shame? Ellis raised an eyebrow. The only shame I see is a mob of men trying to force a woman against her will. You don't understand, Morrison said. If we allow this, others might follow her example. White women thinking they can just consort with Indians. It threatens the natural order. Natural order, Samuel repeated softly. There was something dangerous in his voice now. Like when your soldiers slaughtered children at Sand Creek, when they displayed body parts as trophies. That natural order? Several men shifted uncomfortably. The Sand Creek massacre was recent enough that even these men couldn't pretend ignorance. That was war, Carter said defensively. That was murder. Samuel's voice remained quiet, but Margaret could see the rage beneath. My cousin was there, 7 years old. They cut her. He stopped, jaw clenched. Silence fell over the clearing. Even Morrison seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Finally. Doctor, Ellis spoke. I think we've said enough. Mrs. O'Brien has made her position clear. She's broken no laws. The law of God, Morrison began, is not yours to enforce. Ellis finished. Come, gentlemen. We've wasted enough time. This isn't over, Judge Carter warned. When word spreads, when people hear about this abomination, they'll gossip for a week and find something new to talk about, Ellis said dryly. Mrs. O'Brien, if you need medical attention, send word. I'll come. Thank you, Doctor. Ellis mounted his horse, one by one, reluctantly. The other men followed. Morrison was the last to leave, sitting rigid in his saddle. You've damned yourself, Margaret O'Brien, he said. When judgment comes, remember that you chose this path. I'll remember, Margaret said steadily. I'll remember who offered me kindness and who offered only condemnation. They watched the riders disappear into the trees. When they were gone, Margaret found herself trembling. Samuel guided her inside, settling her by the fire. "They'll be back," she said. "Perhaps, but not today." She looked at him, this man who had stood beside her against her own people. "What you said about Sand Creek, I shouldn't have spoken of it." "No, you should have. They need to know, to understand what their natural order really means." Samuel sat across from her, his dark eyes distant. Understanding and caring are different things. They know what was done. They simply don't see us as human enough for it to matter. Margaret reached across the space between them, taking his hand. It was the first time she deliberately touched him beyond necessity. His fingers were warm, calloused from work. "You matter," she said softly. "To me." He looked at their joined hands, then at her face. "Margaret." "I know," she interrupted. "I know what I'm choosing, not just today, but all the days after. I know it won't be easy. You could still leave, go somewhere else, start over, without the complications I bring. I'm tired of running, tired of being alone." She squeezed his hand. "Aren't you?" He turned her hand over in his, tracing the lines of her palm with one finger. "When I found you in the snow, I thought I was saving just another life. I didn't expect—" "What?" "You," he said simply. "I didn't expect you. Outside." Wind rattled the windows. But inside the cabin was warm, safe. They sat in silence, hands linked, while the fire burned low. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new condemnations. But tonight, they had this, a quiet understanding, a connection that transcended the barriers others would place between them. "Tell me about your grandmother," Margaret said eventually. "The healer." And he did, his voice soft in the firelight, weaving stories of a world she'd never known but was beginning to understand. She listened, their hands still joined, and felt something she'd thought lost forever. Hope. The blizzard struck without warning. One moment the sky was clear. The next, a wall of white descended upon the mountain. Margaret had been checking their rabbit snares when the first winds hit, nearly knocking her off her feet. "Samuel." She could barely see the cabin through the sudden snow, stumbling toward where she thought the door should be. Her hands found wood, and she followed the wall until she reached the entrance, tumbling inside just as the full force of the storm hit. Samuel was already securing the shutters. "The horses," he said tersely. "I need to get them into the lean-to. You can't go out in this." But he was already wrapping himself in his heavy buffalo coat. "If I don't, they'll freeze. Bar the door behind me." He disappeared into the white void. Margaret waited, counting heartbeats, straining to hear anything over the howling wind. When he finally returned, he was covered in snow, his face raw from the cold. "The storm will last days," he said, shaking off the snow. "Maybe a week." Margaret looked at their supplies, the smoked venison hanging from the rafters, the sack of cornmeal, the few preserved vegetables. "Will we have enough?" "We'll manage." But she heard the uncertainty in his voice. For 3 days, the storm raged. The world outside ceased to exist. They rationed carefully, melting snow for water, keeping the fire low to conserve wood. On the 4th day, when they checked their stores, the situation was worse than they'd thought. Much of the venison had spoiled. A leak in the roof they hadn't noticed had let in moisture. "We need food," Samuel said simply. "I'll have to hunt." "In this," Margaret gestured at the still raging storm. "You can't even see past the porch. I know these mountains. There's a small valley 2 miles north where deer shelter during storms. I can make it. And if you can't, if you get lost," he touched her face gently, "I won't get lost." She wanted to argue, but they both knew there was no choice. Without food, they wouldn't last another week. She helped him prepare, wrapping strips of cloth around his face, checking his bow, packing what little food they could spare. "If I'm not back by nightfall," he began. "You'll be back," she interrupted. "You have to be." He kissed her forehead, a brief, warm touch, and then he was gone. Margaret had never known hours could pass so slowly. She tried to busy herself with small tasks, mending, tending the fire, melting snow. But her eyes kept returning to the door. The storm seemed to mock her worry, howling louder with each passing hour. By afternoon, she could stand it no longer. She bundled herself in every piece of warm clothing she could find and ventured onto the porch. The world was a solid wall of white. She could barely see her own hand extended in front of her. "Samuel!" The wind tore the word from her lips. "Samuel!" Nothing. She retreated inside, fear clawing at her chest. What if he was lost? What if he'd fallen? Broken a leg? Was even now freezing to death just yards away and she couldn't see him? As darkness began to fall, she heard something, a sound different from the wind. She threw open the door, and there, barely visible, was a shape moving through the snow. Samuel, dragging something behind him. She ran out, heedless of the cold, helping him pull his burden the last few yards. A deer, small but enough to see them through. Together they halted inside. Samuel collapsed by the fire, shaking uncontrollably. His lips were blue, his hands so cold they couldn't grip. Margaret worked frantically, pulling off his frozen clothes, wrapping him in every blanket they owned, forcing hot tea between his chattering teeth. Thought I was lost," he managed. "Couldn't see anything. Then I heard you calling, followed your voice home." Margaret held him close, feeling the cold radiating from his body. "Don't ever do that again. Promise me." "Can't promise. Would do it again. For you." She wanted to be angry, but relief overwhelmed everything else. They sat wrapped together by the fire while his body slowly warmed. When he could move again, they worked together to butcher the deer, preserving every scrap. The storm continued to rage, but inside their small shelter, they had warmth, food, and each other. That night, as they lay on separate beds of fur, as they always did, Margaret made a decision. She rose and crossed the small space between them. "Margaret?" Samuel's voice was questioning in the darkness. "I almost lost you today," she said softly. "I've lost too much already. My husband, my home, my place in the world. I won't lose you too. Not to pride or propriety or fear." She slipped under his blankets, feeling him tense with surprise. For a moment, neither moved. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close. "Are you certain?" he whispered. "This changes everything. Everything already changed the day you saved me." She pressed her face against his chest, hearing his heartbeat. "I love you, Samuel. I don't care if that makes me a traitor to my race or a fallen woman or whatever else they want to call me. I love you." His arms tightened around her. "And I love you, Margaret O'Brien. I have loved you since you stood between me and those men, fierce as any warrior." They held each other as the storm raged on, two souls finding warmth in a cold world. When morning came, they worked side by side as always, but something fundamental had shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained was gone, replaced by casual touches, shared smiles, the easy intimacy of two people who had chosen each other against all odds. On the 6th day, the storm began to weaken. By the 7th, it had blown itself out, leaving behind a world transformed. Drifts reached the cabin's roof in places. Trees had fallen under the weight of snow. The landscape was alien, beautiful, and deadly. "We'll be cut off for weeks," Samuel observed, surveying the damage. "Maybe months." "Good," Margaret said, surprising him. "Let them forget about us for a while. Let them find other scandals to occupy their righteous anger." They spent the next days digging out, checking on the horses, setting new traps. The work was hard but satisfying. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire, Samuel teaching her words in Comanche, Margaret singing the old songs her mother had taught her. One night, as they lay entwined in their shared bed, Margaret asked, "Do you ever regret it, taking in a troublesome white woman?" Samuel was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. Then, "My people have a saying, the eagle does not ask the wind's permission to fly. You are like that eagle. Margaret, you chose your own path, no matter the storm. How could I regret being part of that flight? She turned in his arms to face him. "And when spring comes? When the pass is clear and people remember we exist? Then we face whatever comes. Together. They won't give up easily. Morrison, Carter, the others. They'll see our happiness as an affront. Let them. Their hatred can't touch what we have built here." Margaret wished she could share his confidence. She knew the world outside wouldn't simply forget them. But here, now, in this moment, she let herself believe it was possible. That love could be enough. That two people from different worlds could create their own outside, an owl called, its voice carrying across the frozen landscape. Samuel pulled her closer, and she felt his breathing slow as sleep took him. She stayed awake a while longer, listening to the profound silence that follows a great storm. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. They would need to hunt again, gather more wood, repair the damage to the roof, and eventually, inevitably, the outside world would intrude on their mountain sanctuary. But tonight, she was warm and loved and free. It was, she thought, more than she had ever dared hope for. And it was enough. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled, not a threat, just another voice in the wilderness they now called home. Margaret closed her eyes and slept, dreaming of spring and whatever battles it might bring. She would face them all. She knew, as long as Samuel stood beside her. They had survived the storm. They would survive whatever came next. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought more than melting snow. It brought ghosts from the past and shadows of violence that would test everything Margaret and Samuel had built together. The first sign of trouble came with hoofbeats on the muddy trail. Margaret was tending the small garden they'd planted, vegetables and herbs coaxed from the reluctant mountain soil, when she heard them, multiple riders, moving fast. Samuel emerged from the cabin, his rifle in hand. "Get inside." But Margaret stood her ground, recognizing one of the horses. "That's Dr. Ellis's mare." Indeed, the doctor was among the riders, but his usual calm demeanor was replaced by urgency. With him rode three men Margaret didn't recognize, their faces grim. "Mrs. O'Brien, Samuel." Ellis dismounted quickly. "Thank God you're both here. We need to talk." "What's happened?" Margaret asked, though her heart already knew it was nothing good. "There's been trouble in town, bad trouble." Ellis glanced at the other men. "These are friends of mine from Fort Laramie. They've brought news you need to hear." One of the men, a weathered scout with kind eyes, stepped forward. "Name's Tom Brennan. Ma'am, I'm sorry to be the bearer of ill tidings, but there's a man in Bitter Creek stirring up something fierce against you folks." Samuel's expression darkened. "Morrison?" "No." Brennan shook his head. "Worse, a man named Jake Coulter. Claims he rode with Carson's regiment. Says he's got unfinished business with a Comanche warrior who killed his brother." Margaret saw Samuel go very still. "I know no Jake Coulter." "He knows you," the second stranger said. "He was younger, with the bearing of a former soldier. Or claims to. Says his brother died at Palo Duro Canyon. Says you were there." "Many died at Palo Duro," Samuel said quietly. "Your soldiers slaughtered hundreds. Women, children, elderly. Then burned everything. Teepees, food stores, clothing, left them to freeze in winter." "I ain't defending it," Brennan said. "But Coulter's got folks worked up. He's been showing a photograph. Claims it proves you murdered his brother in cold blood after the battle was done. That's a lie." Samuel's voice was flat. "I was 14 years at Palo Duro. I watched my family die. I killed no one after. There was no one left to kill." "Doctor," Ellis stepped closer. "The truth doesn't matter to Coulter. He's gathered a group of men, mostly drifters and malcontents. They're drunk on whiskey and hate. Morrison's been preaching about the heathen influence in the mountains. Judge Carter won't stop them. Says it's a matter for the community to resolve." "How many?" Samuel asked. 15, maybe 20. They plan to ride out tomorrow." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. 20 men. Armed, angry, seeking vengeance for imagined wrongs. "We should leave," tonight. Where would you go? Ellis asked gently. Coulter's put out word to every town in 50 miles. Says he'll pay good money to anyone who helps him find the murdering savage and his white whore. The ugly words hit Margaret like a slap, but she forced herself to stay calm. Then what do you suggest? The third stranger, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. I'm James Whitefeather, half Cheyenne, half Irish, all trouble according to my mother. Despite the tension, his slight smile was warm. I've got a place 2 valleys over, hidden. You could come there. Running makes us look guilty. Samuel said, Fighting makes you dead. Whitefeather countered, I've seen Coulter's type before. He don't want justice. He wants blood. They argued back and forth, but Margaret saw the truth in Samuel's eyes. He was tired of running. Had been running, in one way or another, since he was 14. She took his hand. What do you think we should do? She asked softly. He looked at her, and she saw all his pain, all his rage, all his love. I think we make our stand, here, together. Brennan whistled low. 2 against 20? Not 2. Doctor, Ellis said firmly. I'll stand with them. Doc, you can't. I'm 71 years old. Tom, I've lived my life. I won't live the rest of it knowing I let good people die because evil men decided they should. Whitefeather sighed. Well, hell, can't let an old man show me up. Count me in. Brennan looked at his companion. The young soldier. David? David Hartley nodded slowly. I was at Sand Creek, under Chivington. I did things there. Things that haunt me still. Maybe this is my chance to balance the scales a bit. That's 6, Brennan said finally. Better odds than 2, still not good. Then we make them better. Samuel said, This terrain, I know every rock, every tree. They'll be coming up the main trail? Most likely, Ellis confirmed. Coulter's no woodsman. He'll take the easiest path. Samuel nodded, his mind already working. Then we prepare. The rest of the day was spent in frantic activity. Samuel and the men worked on defenses, fallen logs across the trail, positions for cover. Margaret and Doctor. Ellis prepared medical supplies, loaded weapons, filled containers with water. As night fell, Whitefeather shared a bottle of whiskey he'd brought. For courage, he said, though his hands were steady enough. Tell me about Palo Duro, Margaret said to Samuel as they sat together in the darkness. The truth of it. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Mackenzie came at dawn. We were camped in the canyon, thought we were safe. The walls were high, only a few ways in or out, but he found us. His voice was distant, lost in memory. I woke to gunfire. My mother pushed me and my sisters into a ravine, told us to hide. I watched through the rocks as soldiers rode through camp. They shot anyone who moved. My grandfather came out of his teepee. Hands raised. They shot him down like a dog. Margaret gripped his hand tighter. After the killing, they burned everything, our winter supplies, our clothes, our sacred objects. They rounded up our horses, over 1,000, and shot them all. The canyon filled with smoke and the screams of dying animals. When they finally left, I came out, found my mother, my sisters. They'd tried to run. I'm sorry, Margaret whispered, knowing how inadequate the words were. Coulter says his brother died there. Maybe he did. Many soldiers died. We fought back as we could. But I was a boy, hiding in the rocks, watching my world burn. I killed no one that day. I couldn't even save my own family. You saved me, Margaret said. That counts for something. He pulled her close. Everything. It counts for everything. Dawn came too soon. They took their positions, Samuel and Whitefeather on the high ground, Brennan and Hartley flanking the trail, Ellis and Margaret in the cabin with rifles at the windows. They heard them before they saw them. Horses' voices carrying on the morning air. Coulter's voice rose above the others, whiskey-slurred but vicious. Come out, murderer! Face justice like a man! The riders came into view, spreading out as they approached the cabin. Coulter was a big man with a scarred face and cold eyes. He held a rifle across his saddle, and Margaret could see the hate radiating from him like heat. "Samuel Grey Wolf!" Coulter shouted. "I know you're in there. You killed my brother at Palo Duro, shot him in the back as he tried to help wounded soldiers. Your brother died in a massacre he helped create." Samuel's voice carried from somewhere above. "If he died, it was justice, not murder. Lying savage." Coulter raised his rifle. That's when Brennan fired a warning shot, the bullet kicking up dirt at Coulter's horse's feet. "That's far enough. We don't want bloodshed, but we'll defend ourselves." Coulter's men shifted nervously. They'd expected to find 2 people, not 6 armed defenders in good positions. "You'd side with an Indian killer?" Coulter demanded. "Against your own kind." "I side with truth." "Doctor," Ellis called from the cabin. "And the truth is, you're using old hate to justify new violence. Go home, Coulter. Let the dead rest. Not until I have his scalp." Coulter spurred his horse forward. The clearing erupted. Gunfire echoed off the mountains as both sides opened fire. Margaret shot through the window, trying to aim low, to wound rather than kill. She saw one man fall from his horse, clutching his leg. Another threw down his weapon and fled. The battle was fierce but brief. Coulter's men, expecting easy prey, found themselves in a crossfire. Within minutes, several were wounded, others retreating. But Coulter himself pressed forward, firing wildly. Consumed by rage, Margaret saw him aim at the rocks where Samuel was hidden. She didn't think, just acted, bursting from the cabin despite Ellis's shout of warning. "No!" She threw herself between Coulter and Samuel's position just as Coulter fired. The bullet caught her in the shoulder, spinning her around. She fell hard, the world tilting crazily. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Samuel's roar of anguish, saw him rise from cover. What happened next was burned into her memory despite the pain. Samuel came down the hillside like vengeance itself. Coulter tried to reload, but Samuel was on him, pulling him from his horse. They fought in the mud, brutal and desperate. It ended with Coulter on the ground, Samuel's knife at his throat. For a moment, Margaret thought he would do it, thought he would take the vengeance Coulter had come seeking. Then Samuel stood, stepping back. "Go," he said quietly. "Tell everyone. Tell them I could have killed you but didn't. Tell them we want only peace. But if you come again, I won't show mercy twice." Coulter scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of blood and mud and defeat. His remaining men helped him onto a horse, and they fled, leaving their wounded behind. Samuel was at Margaret's side in an instant, his hands gentle but urgent as he examined her wound. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you?" "Because I love you," she said simply. "Because they don't get to take you from me." "Doctor." Ellis was there, competent hands already working. "Clean through," he announced. "Lucky." An inch lower. As Ellis and Samuel worked to stop the bleeding, Margaret looked around the clearing. The wounded were being tended. No one had died, though it had been a near thing. "Is it over?" she asked. White Feather, sporting a graze on his cheek, shook his head. "For now. But Coulter won't forget. Neither will the town. Then we'll be ready," Samuel said. He looked at the men who had fought beside them. "All of us." As they carried Margaret inside, she heard Brennan talking to Hartley. "Never thought I'd see the day. Whites and Indians standing together. Maybe it's a new day." Hartley replied, "Maybe it's time for things to change." Margaret closed her eyes, letting the voices wash over her. She was hurt but alive. Samuel was safe, and they had friends now, allies who had risked everything for them. It wasn't over, might never be truly over, but for now, they had won the right to exist, to love, to live free. It was enough. It was everything. 3 weeks passed before they came for Samuel. Margaret's shoulder had healed enough for her to move without pain, though Dr. Ellis warned against straining it. The morning they arrived, she was hanging laundry while Samuel repaired the roof damage from winter storms. This time it wasn't a mob. Sheriff William Tate rode up alone, his badge glinting in the morning sun. He was a fair man, Margaret knew, one who'd tried to keep order in Bitter Creek despite the town's prejudices. "Samuel Grey Wolf," the sheriff called out, his voice heavy with reluctance. "I need you to come with me." Samuel climbed down from the roof slowly. "On what charge?" "Assault. Jake Coulter's filed formal charges. Says you attacked him without provocation." "That's a lie." Margaret stepped forward. "Coulter came here with 20 men." "I know, Mrs. O'Brien." Tate removed his hat, ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I've heard the whole story from Doc Ellis and the others, but Coulter's got witnesses saying different. Judge Carter's issued a warrant. I've got no choice." Samuel set down his hammer. "And if I refuse, then I'll have to come back with deputies, and it'll go worse for you." Tate looked genuinely pained. "Come peaceful like. We can sort this out proper. Maybe folks will listen to reason." Margaret saw Samuel's jaw tighten. They both knew how likely that was. A Comanche getting justice in a white man's court. But the alternative was becoming fugitives, living forever looking over their shoulders. "I'll come," Samuel said quietly. "No." Margaret grabbed his arm. "You can't trust them. Remember what happened at Sand Creek? They promised safety and then—" "I remember." Samuel covered her hand with his. "But running makes me guilty in their eyes. At least this way. There's a chance." "Samuel Greywolf, I'm placing you under arrest," Sheriff Tate said formally. "You'll need to surrender your weapons." Samuel unbuckled his knife, handed over his rifle. The gesture seemed to pain him more than Margaret's wound had. A Comanche warrior without weapons was like a bird without wings. "I'm coming with you," Margaret announced. "Ma'am, that's not wise." "I'm coming." Her tone brooked no argument. The ride to Bitter Creek took most of the day. Word had spread, and people lined the streets to watch. Some faces showed sympathy, a few of the women who'd lost husbands or sons to violence, who understood grief and loneliness, but most displayed contempt or cruel satisfaction. "There's the Indian lover," someone called out. "Shameless woman!" Margaret held her head high, riding close to Samuel. Let them look. Let them judge. She'd face their hatred as he faced it, with dignity intact. The jail was a small stone building with 2 cells. Sheriff Tate locked Samuel in the larger one, apologizing again for the necessity. "Trial's set for tomorrow. Judge Carter wants this dealt with quick, because he wants Samuel convicted quick," Margaret said bitterly. Tate didn't deny it. "You can stay an hour. I'll be in my office." When they were alone, Margaret gripped the bars of Samuel's cell. "We'll get you out, Doctor. Ellis will testify. And the others? Coulter has more witnesses. Men who'll swear to whatever he pays them to say." Samuel's voice was calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "You should prepare yourself, Margaret." "For what?" "For the possibility that justice, as they define it, will not be served." She wanted to rage, to scream at the unfairness of it all. Instead, she forced herself to think. What about White Feather? He knows lawyers in Fort Laramie. "A lawyer who'll defend a Comanche against white men in this town?" Samuel shook his head. "Don't put hope in miracles." The hour passed too quickly. As Margaret prepared to leave, Samuel called her back. "If this goes badly tomorrow, it won't. Listen to me." His voice was urgent now. "If they convict me, they'll use it as excuse to come after you too. Harboring a criminal, they'll say, 'You need to be ready to run.' I won't leave you. You will if I ask it. Promise me, Margaret. Promise you'll save yourself if necessary." She couldn't speak past the lump in her throat, so she just nodded. But they both knew it was a lie. That night, Margaret stayed at Dr. Ellis's house, one of the few places in town where she was welcome. She didn't sleep, spending the hours pacing and planning. When dawn finally came, she was hollow-eyed, but determined. The courthouse was packed. It seemed every citizen of Bitter Creek had come to watch the spectacle. Judge Carter presided, his heavy face already set in lines of disapproval. The jury was 12 men, all white, all known to harbor no love for Indians. Jake Coulter sat in the front row, his face still bearing marks from the fight. He'd cleaned himself up, looking almost respectable. The men beside him, his witnesses, were less convincing, obvious drifters and troublemakers. The trial was a mockery from the start. The prosecutor, a thin man named Graves, painted Samuel as a dangerous savage who'd attacked peaceful citizens. Coulter testified that he'd merely come to talk, to seek information about his brother's death, when Samuel had attacked without provocation. Lies? Margaret couldn't help herself. All lies. Remove that woman, Judge Carter ordered, but Sheriff Tate pretended not to hear. When it came time for the defense, Samuel was allowed to speak for himself. No lawyer had agreed to represent him. He stood tall, dignified despite the shackles on his wrists. "I do not deny fighting Jake Coulter," he said, his voice carrying clearly. "But it was in defense of my home, my woman, and my life. He came with 20 armed men, threatening violence. We defended ourselves, nothing more." "Your woman?" Prosecutor Graves sneered. "You mean the white woman you've corrupted, stolen from her own people?" "No one stole me," Margaret said loudly. "I chose my own path." "Mrs. O'Brien, you're not recognized to speak," Judge Carter warned. "But Dr." Ellis stood up. "I was there. Your Honor, I saw everything." "Coulter's men fired first." Samuel showed remarkable restraint. "A biased witness," Graves interrupted, "known to harbor radical views about race mixing." The trial continued in this vein. Brennan and Hartley testified to the truth, but their words were dismissed. Coulter's paid witnesses spun tales of Samuel's supposed violence, his savage nature, the danger he posed to civilized folks. As the jury retired to deliberate, Margaret knew what was coming. The verdict was predetermined, had been from the moment Samuel was arrested. Still, when they returned after barely 15 minutes, her heart sank. "Guilty," the foreman announced, "on all charges." The courtroom erupted. Some cheered. Others looked uncomfortable with the obvious injustice. Judge Carter banged his gavel for order. "Samuel Graywolf," he intoned, "you have been found guilty of assault with intent to kill. Under normal circumstances, this would carry a prison sentence. However, given your savage nature and the threat you pose to our community, I sentence you to hang by the neck until dead, sentenced to be carried out at dawn tomorrow." "No!" Margaret surged forward, but hands held her back. "You can't do this! It's murder!" "It's justice," Carter replied coldly. "And you, Mrs. O'Brien, would do well to remember that harboring criminals is also a crime. Sheriff, remove the prisoner." As they dragged Samuel away, his eyes found Margaret's. In them, she saw not fear but sorrow, not for himself, but for her. She fought against the restraining hands, screaming his name, until someone, she never knew who, struck her, and the world went dark. She woke in Dr. Ellis's spare room, her head pounding. White Feather sat beside the bed, his face grim. "How long?" she asked. "Few hours. Sun's going down. We have to do something. Break him out." "Already being arranged," White Feather said quietly. "Brennan and Hartley are with us. A few others, too, men who've had enough of Carter's version of justice. We move at midnight." Hope flared in Margaret's chest. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay here. Stay safe. Let us handle—" "No." She sat up despite the dizziness. "I'm coming?" "Margaret, would you stay behind if it was your woman in that cell?" White Feather sighed. "Stubborn as any Comanche woman? Fine, but you do exactly as we say." The hours until midnight crawled by. "Doctor." Ellis provided dark clothing, a rifle, ammunition. As they prepared to leave, he pressed a package into Margaret's hands. "Money," he said, "and a letter of introduction to friends in California. After tonight, you'll need to run far. Come with us," Margaret urged. "I'm too old for running. Besides, someone needs to stay and tell the truth of what happened here." He embraced her briefly. "Take care of each other." They moved through the dark streets like shadows. The jail had 2 guards, one at the front, one at the back. Brennan and Hartley took the rear while White Feather and Margaret approached from the front. The guard was dozing, rifle across his lap. White Feather moved like smoke, And suddenly, the guard was unconscious, trussed like a turkey. They found the keys and moved inside. Samuel was sitting in the dark, hands folded. When he saw them, something blazed in his eyes. Hope, love, life. "Foolish woman," he said as Margaret unlocked his cell. "I told you to run." "Foolish man," she replied, her voice thick with tears. "Thinking I'd leave you." They had no time for more. Voices shouted outside. The rear guard had raised an alarm. Gunfire erupted as they ran for the horses Whitefeather had waiting. "There!" someone shouted. "The murderer's escaping!" More guns fired. Margaret felt a bullet whistle past her ear. They reached the horses, Samuel lifting her into the saddle before mounting his own. Behind them, the town was waking, lights appearing in windows, voices calling for blood. They rode hard into the darkness, the sound of pursuit growing behind them. At a crossroads, Brennan and Hartley peeled off. "We'll lead them south," Brennan called. "You head north. Good luck." Margaret wanted to thank them, but there was no time. They rode on, Whitefeather leading them through paths only he seemed to know. Behind them, the lights of Bitter Creek faded, but they could still hear horses, dogs, angry voices carrying on the wind. "They'll follow," Samuel said. "Carter won't let this stand." "Then we keep running," Margaret replied. "As far as we need to." Whitefeather led them to a hidden canyon where fresh horses waited. "Friends," he explained. "The Underground Railroad isn't just for escaped slaves. Sometimes it's for anyone seeking freedom." As they changed mounts, Samuel gripped Whitefeather's shoulder. "Brother, what you've done is what anyone should do when law becomes injustice." Whitefeather smiled grimly. "Now ride. Don't stop until you reach the territories. Maybe not even then." They rode through the rest of the night and into the dawn. When the sun rose, they were miles from Bitter Creek, in country Margaret had never seen. Behind them, no signs of pursuit. Brennan and Hartley had done their job well. "Are we safe?" Margaret asked. "For now," Samuel replied. "But we'll always need to watch. Men like Carter and Coulter have long memories and longer reaches." "Then we'll watch together." They stopped at a stream to water the horses. Margaret looked at Samuel. Alive, free, hers, and felt tears spring to her eyes. "No tears," he said softly, pulling her close. "We're alive. We're together. That's all that matters. I thought I'd lost you when they said hanging." "Shh." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I'm here. We're here, and we're free." As they mounted again, heading toward an uncertain future, Margaret thought about the word. Free. Such a simple word, but so hard won. They'd paid for it in blood and tears, in loss and separation from everything they'd known. But as she rode beside Samuel into the vast unknown, she knew it was worth any price. They were free to love, free to live, free to be. Behind them, the past fell away like shadows before the rising sun. Ahead lay California, or Oregon, or wherever the road might take them. It didn't matter. They would face it together, two souls united against a world that said they shouldn't be. "Ready?" Samuel asked. Margaret smiled, the first real smile in days. Always. They rode on. Into the morning, into their future, into freedom. 6 months later, the morning sun painted the Oregon Valley gold as Margaret stood in the doorway of their new cabin. It was smaller than the one in the mountains, but it was theirs, built with their own hands on land they'd claimed legally. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, far enough for privacy, close enough for the occasional visit. Samuel was working with the horses in the corral they'd built. They had 3 now, including a pregnant mare that promised to be the start of their breeding stock. It was honest work, and Samuel had discovered he had a gift for gentling wild horses, teaching them to trust human hands. "Letter came," Margaret called out, waving the envelope that had arrived with the weekly supply wagon. Samuel vaulted the fence, moving with the easy grace that still made her heart skip. "From whom?" "Dr. Ellis." She opened it carefully, reading aloud. "My dear friends, I hope this finds you well and settled. The news from Bitter Creek may interest you. Jake Coulter was found dead last month, killed in a saloon fight over cards. It seems his nature finally caught up with him. Judge Carter suffered a stroke and has retired. The new judge, a younger man from Denver, seems more interested in actual justice than maintaining old prejudices. Morrison still preaches his poison, but fewer listen. The town is changing, slowly. New families arriving, some of mixed heritage themselves. Perhaps one day you might even return, though I understand if that day never comes. White Feather sends his regards. He's married now, a schoolteacher from Boston who scandalized her family by choosing him. They seem happy. Brennan and Hartley made it to California safely and have started a freight company. I am old but content, knowing I played some small part in seeing justice done, even if it wasn't in a courtroom. Take care of each other. You remain in my prayers. Your friend, Thomas Ellis. Margaret folded the letter carefully. Coulter's dead, and I feel nothing, Samuel said quietly. No satisfaction, no relief. He seems like part of another life. Because he is... Margaret touched his face, traced the scar that ran from temple to jaw. We're different people now. It was true. The frightened widow who'd stumbled through the snow seemed like a stranger. This Margaret was strong, tanned from working in the sun, hands calloused from building their new life. She could shoot, ride, track game. More importantly, she'd found her voice, her strength, her purpose. Samuel had changed too. The haunted warrior who'd lived alone in the mountains had found peace, or at least as much peace as a man with his memories could find. He smiled more now, laughed at her attempts to learn Comanche words, held her through the nights when old ghosts came calling. Any regrets? He asked, as he often did. Only one, she said, and saw concern flash in his eyes. I wish my mother could have met you. She would have loved you. He pulled her close. And I wish my family could have known you, my grandmother especially. She always said the heart knows no boundaries. Only people create those. They stood together watching the sun climb higher. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily, riding the morning thermals. The valley stretched before them, green and promising. We should head to town today, Samuel said. Need supplies for the barn raising. Town was the small settlement of Cedar Falls, 20 miles north. When they'd first arrived, Margaret had been terrified of how they'd be received, but the Oregon frontier was different from Bitter Creek. Here, survival mattered more than skin color. Their neighbors, Germans, Irish, Chinese, even a few other mixed couples, judged them by their work ethic and character, not their marriage. They hitched the wagon and made the journey. Talking of plans for the future, the mare would foal in spring. They'd plant a larger garden, maybe add some fruit trees. Samuel had been offered work-breaking horses for the army. Ironic, considering his history with soldiers. But he was pragmatic about it. In town, they split up to accomplish errands faster. Margaret was selecting fabric at the general store when she heard a familiar voice that made her blood freeze. Well, Margaret O'Brien, or whatever you call yourself now. She turned slowly. Mrs. Henderson stood there, older and grayer but unmistakable. Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her hip, where her pistol rested. Mrs. Henderson, she said evenly. You're far from home. My sister lives here now. I'm visiting. The older woman's eyes were cold. I heard rumors you'd fled this way, living in sin with that savage. They said, I see the rumors were true. I'm living in marriage with my husband, Margaret corrected. We were wed by a justice of the peace 3 months ago. All legal and proper, since you seem concerned with such things. Mrs. Henderson's face twisted. Marriage. As if that makes it right. You're a disgrace to your race. And you're a bitter woman who drove her husband to drink with your cruelty. The words came out before Margaret could stop them. Yes, everyone knew. Just as they knew he took his temper out on the help because he couldn't stand up to you. How dare you? I dare because I'm free. Free of you, of Bitter Creek, of all the small, mean people who try to break me. Margaret stepped closer. And if you think to cause trouble for us here, remember, this isn't Bitter Creek. People here judge by actions, not prejudice. As if to prove her point, Mr. Schultz, the store owner, appeared. Everything all right, Mrs. Grey Wolf. Mrs. Grey Wolf. Margaret still felt a thrill hearing it. Fine, Mr. Schultz, Mrs. Henderson was just leaving. The older woman looked between them, saw no support in the shopkeeper's face, and retreated. At the door, she turned back. You'll pay for this eventually. God's judgment is not yours to dispense. Margaret finished. Good day, Mrs. Henderson. When she was gone, Mr. Schultz shook his head. Some people carry hate like a treasured possession. You okay? Better than okay. And she was. The encounter that would once have terrified her had only proved how far she'd come. She found Samuel at the blacksmith's, ordering nails for the barn. His face tightened when she told him about Mrs. Henderson. Should we be worried? No, Margaret said firmly. She has no power here, no one who'd listen to her poison. They loaded their supplies and headed home. The sun was setting as they reached their valley, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Their cabin sat nestled against a hill, smoke rising from the chimney where they'd banked the morning fire. Home, Samuel said softly. Home. Margaret agreed. That night, as they lay in their bed, a real bed now, not furs on the floor, Margaret thought about their journey. From that frozen day when Samuel had found her dying in the snow to this warm Oregon night, wrapped in his arms. They'd faced hatred, violence, injustice. They'd lost their old lives but found new ones. Tell me again, she said, what you told those men that day. Samuel knew what she meant. I want you for your untamed soul. He quoted softly. Still true, more true every day. My soul feels pretty tamed now, she teased. Content, happy, even. Content is not tamed. A wild horse can be content in a good pasture, but it never loses its fire. He kissed her shoulder. You still have your fire. Margaret Grey Wolf. I see it every day. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the valley. An owl hooted from the big pine behind the cabin. The sounds of the wilderness that had once frightened Margaret now seemed like a lullaby, familiar and comforting. Do you think we'll always be running? She asked. Always looking over our shoulders? Maybe, but we're not running now. We're living, building, growing. He paused. My people have a saying. The wolf who runs with purpose is not fleeing but seeking. We sought and we found. What did we find? Each other, this place, a chance to live as we choose. His arms tightened around her. Freedom to love without apology. Margaret turned in his arms, kissing him deeply. I love you, Samuel Grey Wolf. Thank you for saving me that day. You saved yourself. I just gave you a chance to heal. He smiled in the darkness. And you saved me too. From loneliness, from hate eating me hollow. We saved each other. They made love then, slow and tender, a confirmation of all they'd survived and all they'd built. Afterward, as Samuel slept. Margaret rose and walked to the window. The moon was rising, full and bright, silvering the landscape. She thought of Bitter Creek, of the narrow life she'd escaped. Thought of those who'd helped them. Doctor, Ellis, White Feather, Brennan and Hartley. Good people who'd chosen conscience over conformity. She hoped they were well, hoped the world was changing, even if slowly. A movement caught her eye. A wolf stood at the edge of their property, majestic in the moonlight. It looked toward the cabin, and for a moment, Margaret felt a connection. Two wild souls who'd found their territory, their pack, their home. The wolf melted back into the forest, and Margaret returned to bed. Samuel stirred, pulling her close without waking. She listened to his breathing, felt his heartbeat against her back, and knew peace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The barn to finish, horses to train, a life to continue building. There might be other Mrs. Hendersons, other Jake Coulters, other Judge Carters. The world was full of those who feared difference, who hated what they couldn't understand. But there would also be more Dr. Ellis's, More people willing to see past skin color to the souls beneath. And most importantly, there would be her and Samuel, facing whatever came together. "No, I want you for your untamed soul," she whispered into the darkness, repeating the words that had changed everything. They'd been a revelation then, that someone could want her not for her body or her service, but for her spirit, her strength, her wildness. Now they were a promise, a reminder that love could transcend boundaries, that two people from different worlds could create their own, that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion was simply to live, to love, to be happy despite those who would deny you that right. The moon traveled across the sky, marking the passage of night toward dawn. Soon the sun would rise on another day in their new life. Margaret closed her eyes, Samuel's warmth surrounding her, and slept. In her dreams, she ran through endless grasslands, wild and free, a wolf beside her. They ran not from but toward horizon after horizon, toward all the possibilities that awaited two untamed souls who'd found their way home. The story of the lonely Comanche and the woman he'd saved from the snow had become the story of Samuel and Margaret Grey Wolf, horse breeders in Oregon, living proof that love could conquer hate, that freedom was worth any price, and that sometimes the most beautiful endings were actually beginnings in disguise. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us on this journey through the untamed American frontier. We hope Margaret and Samuel's story has touched your hearts as it has ours. Where are you listening to this tale of love conquering all? Please share in the comments below. We'd love to connect with fellow souls who appreciate these Wild West love stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel From Wild West and share your thoughts about Margaret and Samuel's journey. Until our next adventure on the frontier, keep your hearts wild and your spirits free.